Ubbo Sathla by Clark Ashton Smith, originally published in Weird Tales, July 1933. The Book of Ibon says, "For Ubbo Sathla is the source and the end, before the coming of Sathakua are Yak Zothoth are Cthulhut from the stars. Ubbo Sathla dwelt in the steaming fens of the new-made earth, a mass without head or members, spawning the gray, formless efts of the prime and grisly prototypes of terrene life. And all earthly life, it is told, shall go back at last through the great circle of time to Ubbo Sathla." Paul Tragardus found the milky crystal in a litter of oddments from many lands and eras. He had entered the shop of the curio dealer through an aimless impulse, with no object in mind other than the idle distraction of eyeing and fingering a miscellany of far-gathered things. Looking desultorily about, his attention had been drawn by a dull glimmering on one of the tables, and had extricated the queer orb-like stone from its shadowy, crowded position between an ugly little Aztec idol, the fossil egg of a Dinornis, and an obscure fetish, a black wood from the Niger. The thing was about the size of a small orange, and was slightly flattened at the ends, like a planet at its poles. It puzzled Tragardus, for it was not like an ordinary crystal, being cloudy and changeable with, and darkened from within. Being cloudy and changeable, with an intermittent glowing in its heart, as if it were alternately illumined and darkened from within. Holding it to the wintry window, he studied it for a while, without being able to determine the secret of this singular and regular alternation. His puzzlement was soon complicated by a dawning sense of vague and irrecognizable familiarity, as if he had seen the thing before under circumstances that were now wholly forgotten. He appealed to the curio dealer, a dwarfish Hebrew with an air of dusty antiquity, who gave the impression of being lost to commercial considerations in some web of Kabbalistic reverie. Money magic in all areas of the world is, one of the most common types of magic. "Can you tell me anything about this?" The dealer gave an indescribable, simultaneous shrug of his shoulders and his eyebrows. "It is very old. Pelagian, one might say. I cannot tell you much, for little is known. A geologist found it in Greenland, beneath glacial ice, in the Miocene strata. Who knows? It may belong to some sorcerer, a primeval fool. Greenland was a warm, fertile region beneath the sun of Miocene times. No doubt it is a magic crystal, and a man might behold strange visions in its heart if he looked long enough. Kind of like people visiting the British Museum and looking into the obsidian mirror of Dr. D, which people really don't get the opportunity to look at that one too long. Tregardas was quite startled, for the dealer's apparently fantastic suggestion had brought to mind his own delvings in a branch of the strangest and rarest of occult forgotten volumes, which is said to have come down through a series of manifold translations from a prehistoric original written in the lost language of Hyperborea. Tregardas, with much difficulty, had obtained the medieval French version, a copy that had been owned by many generations of sorcerers and Satanists. What's the difference? There is a difference, but what is the difference? But had never been able to find the Greek manuscripts from which the version was derived. The remote, fabulous original was supposed to have been the work of a great Hyperborean wizard, from whom it had taken its name. It was an incantation of dark and baleful myths, of liturgies, rituals, and incantations both evil and esoteric, not without shudders in the course of studies the average person would have considered more than singular. Tregardas had collected the French volume, with the frightful Necronomicon of the mad Arab. Abdul-Hazred had found much correspondences of the blackest and most appalling significance, together with much forbidden data that was either unknown to the Arab or omitted by him, or by his translators. Was this what he had been trying to recall? Tregardas wondered. The brief causal reference in the Book of Ibon to a cloudy crystal that had been owned by the wizard Zon Mazamalek in Mahou Thulan. Of course, it was all too fantastic, too hypothetic, too incredible. But Mahou Thulan, that northern portion of ancient Hyperborea, was supposed to have corresponded roughly with modern Greenland, which had formerly been joined as a peninsula to the main continent. Could the stone in his hand, by some fabulous fortuity, be the crystal of Zon Mazamalek? Tregardas smiled at himself with inward irony, for even conceiving the absurd notion, such things did not occur, at least not in present-day London, and in all likelihood the Book of Ibon was sheer superstitious fancy. Anyway, nevertheless, there was something about the crystal that continued to tease and inveigle him. He ended by purchasing it at a fairly moderate price. The sum was named by the seller and paid by the buyer without bargaining. With the crystal in his pocket, Paul Tregardas hastened back to his lodgings. Instead of resuming his leisurely saunter, he installed the milky globe on his writing table, where it stood firmly enough on one of its oblate ends. Then, still smiling at his own absurdity, he took down the yellow parchment manuscript of the Book of Ibon from its place in a somewhat inclusive collection of Recherche literature. He opened the vermiculated leather cover with hasps of tarnished steel and read over to himself, translating from the archaic French as he read the paragraph that referred to Zon Mazamalek. This wizard, who was mighty among sorcerers, had found a cloudy stone, orb-like and somewhat flattened at the ends, in which he could behold many visions of the terrene past, even to the earth's beginning, when Ubbo Sathla, the unbegotten source, lay vast and swollen and yeasty amid the vaporing slime. But of that which he beheld, Zon Mazamalek left little record, and people say that he vanished presently in a way that is not known, and after him the cloudy crystal was lost. Now, there are certain effects that certain things have, the materials and the shapes and all that. One thing that we need to perhaps realize is that in terms of spiritual relationships and such, it's not so much the object that we're using, but our own relationships that we are involving, what we ourselves are doing with these things. I know this book is fiction, but, there's some points to bring up. That's why I'm going over it. Paul Tregartis laid the manuscript aside. Again, there was something that tantalized and beguiled him, like a lost dream or a memory, forfeit to oblivion. Impelled by a feeling which he did not scrutinize or question, he sat down before the table and began to stare intently into the cold, nebulous orb. He felt an expectation which somehow was so familiar, so permeative, a part of his consciousness, that he did not even name it to himself. Minute by minute he sat and watched the alternate glimmering and fading of the mysterious light in the heart of the crystal. By imperceptible degrees, there stole upon him a sense of dreamlike duality, both in respect to his person and his surroundings. He was still Paul Tregartis, and yet he was someone else. The room was his London apartment, and a chamber in some foreign but well-known place. And, in both milieus, he peered steadfastly into the same crystal. After an interim, without surprise, on the part of Tregartis, the process of re-identification became complete. He knew that he was Zon Mazamalek, a sorcerer of Mahul Thulan, and a student of all lore anterior to his own epoch, wise with dreadful secrets that were not known to Paul Tregartis, amateur of anthropology and the occult sciences in latter-day London. He sought by means of the milky crystal to attain an even older and more fearful knowledge. So was it Tolan or Thulan? But certainly, it's not that we say, oh, well, I am this great sorcerer from ancient antiquity, although some people literally act and like, oh, that they really are. But we are taking on the roles. It's not to say that when we pick up a deck of tarot cards that we are a princess and a queen, like a literal male and female if we're not a male or female, or if we're a different age and that sort of stuff. But all this stuff refers to us. And when we involve mythological themes, we're identifying, as it would be called. We're taking on the left-hand path as we connect through the right-hand path. These things aren't separate. Too many people, and I am the left-hand path. It's not the same as being those on the left hand on the day of judgment or something. He had acquired the stone in dubitable ways from a more than sinister source. It was unique and without fellow in any land or time. In its depths, all former years, all things it had ever been, were supposedly mirrored and would reveal themselves to the present visionary. And through the crystal, Zon Mazamalek had dreamt to recover the wisdom of the gods, or so-called gods, who died before the earth was born. They had passed the lightless void, leaving their lore inscribed upon tablets of ultra-stellar stone, and the tablets were guarded by the primal mire, by the formless, idiotic demiurge, Ubbo Sathla. Only by means of the crystal could he hope to find and read the tablets. For the first time he was making trial of the globe's reputed virtues. About him, an ivory-paneled chamber, filled with his magic books and paraphernalia. He was fading slowly from his consciousness. Before him, on a table of some dark, Hyperborean wood that had been graven with grotesque ciphers, the crystal appeared to swell and deepen in its filmy depth. He beheld a swift and broken swirling of dim scenes fleeing like bubbles of a mill race, as if he looked upon an actual world. Cities, forests, mountains, seas, and meadows flowed beneath him, lightening and darkening as with the passage of days and nights in some weirdly accelerated stream of time. Zon Mazamalek had forgotten Paul Tregartis had lost the remembrance of his own entity and his own surroundings in Mhu Dolan, which, this kind of differs with what you see in Surah 53 of the Quran, where identity was never lost, yet the highest of experiences had. The visionary consciousness didn't negate, didn't separate from the physical and the emotional consciousness. Moment by moment, the flowing vision in the crystal became more definite and distinct, and the orb itself deepened till he grew giddy, as if he was peering from an insecure height into some nether-fathomed abyss. He knew that time was racing backward in the crystal, was unrolling for him the pageant of all past days, but a strange alarm had seized him, and he feared to gaze longer, like one who had nearly fallen from a precipice. He caught himself with a violent start, and drew back from the mystic orb. Again to his gaze, the enormous whirling world into which he had peered was a small and cloudy crystal on his rune-wrought table in Mhu Dolan. Then by degrees it seemed that the great room, with sculptured panels of mammoth ivory, was narrowing to another and dingier place, and Zan Mazamalek, losing his preternatural wisdom and sorcerous power, went back, by a weird regression, into Paul Tregardas. And yet, not wholly, it seemed, was he able to return. Tregardas, dazed and wondering, found himself before the writing table on which he had set the oblate sphere. He felt the confusion of one who has dreamt, and has not fully awakened from the dream. The room puzzled him vaguely, as if something were wrong with its size and furnishings, and his remembrance of purchasing the crystal from a curio dealer was oddly and discrepantly mingled with an impression that he had acquired it in a very different manner. He felt that something very strange had happened to him when he peered into the crystal, but just what it was he could not seem to recollect. It had left him in the sort of psychic muddlement that follows a debauch of hashish. He assured himself that he was Paul Tregardas, that he lived on a certain street in London, that the year was 1933, but such commonplace varieties had somehow lost their meaning and their validity, and everything about him was shadow-like and insubstantial. The very walls seemed to waver like smoke. The people in the streets were phantoms of phantoms, and he himself was a lost shadow, a wandering echo of something long forgot. The madness of demons is upon him, right? He resolved that he would not repeat his experiment of crystal gazing. The effects were too unpleasant and equivocal. But the very next day, by an unreasoning impulse to which he yielded almost mechanically without reluctation, he found himself seated before the misty orb. He became the sorcerer Zan Mazamalek in Mhu Dolan. Again he dreamt, to retrieve the wisdom of the ante-mundane gods, as he called them. He again drew back from the deepening crystal with the terror of one who fears to fall, and once more doubtfully and dimly, like a failing wraith, he was Paul Tregardas. Now, whether you call it worship or not, you can evoke yourself, you can evoke a theme without worshiping something, without worshiping a demiurge or something. But if you're calling up beings to teach you, or hoping that they will teach you or grant you this, it's worship. There's a reason why you're calling them gods, or maybe you don't like that term. Because a lot of people nowadays are really devout worshippers of this, that, and the other, but they pretend, oh, I'm not worshiping them. I'm the one that's being the god. Not, I'm. Three times did Tregardas repeat the experience on successive days, and each time his own person and the world about him became more tenuous and confused than before. His sensations were those of a dreamer who was on the verge of waking, and London itself was unreal as the lands that slipped from the dreamer's ken. Receding in filmy mist and cloudy light, Beyond it all, he felt the looming and crowding of vast imageries, alien but half familiar. It was as if the phantasmagoria of time and space were dissolving about him to reveal some veritable reality or another dream of space and time. There came at last the day when he sat down before the crystal and did not return as Paul Tregardas. It was the day when Zamalek, boldly disregarding certain evil and portentous warnings, resolved to overcome his curious fear of falling bodily into the visionary world that he beheld, a fear that had hitherto prevented him from following the backward stream of time for any distance. He must, he assured himself, conquer his fear if he were ever to see and read the lost tablets of the gods. He had beheld nothing more than a few fragments of the years of Mahothulan immediately posterior to the present, the years of his own lifetime. And there were inestimable cycles between these years and the beginning. Again to his gaze, the crystal deepened immeasurably, with scenes and happenings that flowed in a retrograde stream. Again, the magic ciphers of the dark table faded from his ken, and the sorcerously carven walls of his chamber melted into less than dream. Once more he grew giddy with an awful vertigo as he bent above the swirling and milling of the terrible gulfs of time in the world-like orb. Fearfully, in spite of his resolution, he would have drawn away, but he looked and leaned too long. There was a sense of abysmal falling, a suction as of electable winds, of maelstorms, that bore him down through the fleet, unstable visions of his own past life into antenatal years and dimensions. He seemed to endure the pangs of an inverse dissolution, and then he was no longer Zamalek, the wise and learned watcher of the crystal, but an actual part of the weirdly racing stream that ran back to reattain the beginning. Now, without guidance, when you realize that I am not this body, I'm not these names I take on, I'm not the roles that are connected to these names, I'm not my thoughts, I'm not my emotions, I'm not even my will. This can be a hard realization for some people if they're, without some other context involved with what's going on. They may not be able to distinguish their life from lives that they've thought as possibilities. But in general, you become more sane, not less sane. But he seemed to live unnumbered lives, to die myriad deaths, forgetting each time the death and life that had gone before. He fought as a warrior in half-legendary battles. He was a child playing in the ruins of some olden city of Mahothulan. He was the king who had reigned when the city was in its prime, the prophet who had foretold its building and its doom, a woman he wept for, the bygone dead in necropoli, long crumbled, an antique wizard. He muttered the rude spells of earlier sorcery, a priest of some pre-human entity. He wielded the sacrificial knife in cave temples and pillared basalt. Life by life, era by era, he retraced the long and groping cycles through which Hyperborea had arisen from savagery to a high civilization. And let's remember that the Jinn came before us. So the Janut, the Janut's an overlapping reality with the Natsut, the physical reality, and the spiritual reality that's the humans and animals. But he became a barbarian of some troglodytic tribe, fleeing from the slow torrided ice of a former glacial age into lands illumined by the ruddy flare of perpetual volcanoes. Then, after incomputable years, he was no longer man, but a man-like beast, roving in the forest of giant fern and calamite, or building an uncouth nest in the boughs of mighty cycads. Through aeons of anterior sensation, of crude lust and hunger, of aboriginal terror and madness, there was someone, or something, that went ever backward in time. Death became birth, and birth was death. In a slow version of reverse change, the earth appeared to melt away, to slough off the hills and mountains of its latter strata. Always, the sun grew larger and hotter above the fuming swamps that teemed with a crasser life, with a more fulsome vegetation, and the thing that had been Paul Trigardus, that had been Zon Zamalek, was part of all the monstrous devolution. It flew with the claw-tip wings of a pterodactyl. It swam in tepid seas with the vast, whining bulk of Ichthyosaurus. It bellowed uncouthly with the armored throat of some forgotten behemoth to the huge moon that burned through Liassic mists. At length, after aeons of immemorial brutehood, it became one of the lost serpent men who reared their cities of black gneiss and fought their venomous wars in the world's first continent. It walked undulously in anti-human streets. In strange crooked vaults, it peered at primeval stars from high. Babylonian towers, it bowed with hissing litanies to great serpent idols. Through years and ages of the Ophidian era, it returned, and was a thing that crawled in the ooze, that had not yet learned to think and dream and build. At the time came when there was no longer a continent, but only a vast, chaotic marsh, a sea of slime without limit or horizon, that seethed with the blind writhing of amorphous vapors. There, in the gray beginning of earth, the formless mass that was Ubbo Sathla reposed amid the slime and vapors, heedless, without organs or members. It slothed from its oozy sides in a slow, ceaseless wave the amoebic forms that were the archetypes of earthly life. Horrible it was, if there had been aught to apprehend the horror, and loathsome if there had been any to feel loathing. About it, prone or tilted in the mire, there lay the mighty tablets of star-quarried stone that were writ with the inconceivable wisdom of the pre-mundane entities. And there, to the goal of a forgotten search, was drawn the thing that he had been, or would sometimes be, Paul Trigardus and Zon Zamalek, becoming a shapeless eft of the prime. It crawled sluggishly and obliviously across the fallen tablets of the entities, and fought and ravened blindly with the other spawn of Ubbo Sathla, of Zon Zamalek, and his vanishing. There is no mention anywhere, save the brief passage in the book of Ibon concerning Paul Trigardus, who also disappeared. There was a curt notice in several London papers. No one seemed to have known anything about him. He is gone, as if he had never been, and the crystal, presumably, is gone too, or at least no one has found it.